Number 1. At 19 years old, Patricia Hearst moved through Berkeley as a private figure from a very public dynasty. The granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, a college student with a measured, almost shy public presence. She appeared worlds away from political extremism or underground violence. That image shattered on a winter night when armed members of the Symbionese Liberation Army burst into her apartment and abducted her, setting off one of the most bewildering crime sagas of the decade. Her life before the abduction radiated inherited privilege rather than celebrity flash. A well-known last name, connections to philanthropy, and access to the insulated spaces of American wealth. Think quiet, upscale homes, carefully curated appearances, and the kind of social gravity that opens doors without fanfare. That pedigree would soon collide with grainy security footage and wanted posters, creating a jarring split screen between marble foyers and safe houses, between gala invitations and clandestine communiques. Pressure mounted in confinement. According to later accounts, the group pressed her with threats and revolutionary rhetoric, while the outside world watched the Hearst family struggle to meet impossible demands. In the spring, an audio tape appeared. A new name, a new allegiance, and a declaration that suggested she had crossed an invisible line. The transformation, whether survival, coercion, or conversion, became the question around which everything else would turn. Within weeks, cameras caught a shocking scene. A young woman in a beret, holding a carbine during the robbery of a neighborhood branch of Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. The images traveled everywhere, searing a moment into public memory and igniting a national argument over agency and fear. She was captured the following year, and the headlines only grew louder as prosecutors framed her not as a pawn, but as a willing participant. The trial in the late winter of 1976 unfolded like theater celebrity lawyers, a divided public, and a jury asked to weigh brainwashing against culpability. The verdict was guilty. The court initially referenced a theoretical maximum of 35 years, but the sentence imposed after judicial reassignment was 7 years. The distinction mattered. One number measured the outer edge of the statute, the other defined her actual punishment. In the years that followed, mercy intervened. After she had served just under 2 years, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, citing humanitarian considerations amid a roiling debate about coercion and trauma. Years later, a final act of clemency arrived from another White House. A full presidential pardon that closed the legal chapter of the case and reframed her status in the eyes of the government. What, then, motivated her? Some see a young woman battered by captivity and terror. Others read a portrait of susceptibility, ideology, and identity collapse under pressure. Psychologists and commentators have debated the language brainwashing, Stockholm Syndrome, survival response, without ever fully resolving how fear and choice braided together. The ambiguity is part of the case's gravity. An heiress whose gilded background did not shield her from extreme vulnerability. A defendant whose surname amplified every frame of footage. Prison, brief as it was, marked the hinge between spectacle and aftermath. Over time, Patricia Hearst Shaw shifted toward quieter pursuits, with occasional public sightings far from the tumult that once defined her name. Yet the story endures because of its contradictions: wealth and captivity, sympathy and blame, image and evidence, an American parable written in competing narratives and indelible pictures. Today, her original 7-year sentence stands commuted, and she later received a full presidential pardon in January 20th, 2001. Number 2. Leona Helmsley moved through Manhattan society with a diamond-hard gaze and an empire of hotels bearing her name. A self-made public persona fused with a strategic marriage to real estate titan Harry Helmsley turned her into a symbol of 80s power. Meticulously tailored suits, a signature coif, and a reputation for command. In the late years of that decade, as she neared her late 60s, the woman tabloids called the Queen of Mean stood at the center of a storm that would test the limits of wealth, image, and accountability. Her world radiated privilege. The couple controlled landmark addresses and hosted in rooms trimmed with marble and gilt. Flights by company jet, service at a gesture, a palace-like residence in Connecticut. These were not luxuries. They were the air she breathed. That opulence, however, contained the seeds of her undoing. Contractors alleged that private renovations were quietly billed to corporate ledgers, and the whispers became subpoenas. The velvet rope of high society gave way to grand jury rooms and fluorescent-lit evidence tables. Pressure revealed a fault line. Prosecutors assembled receipts, invoices, and testimony to argue that personal extravagance had been disguised as business expense. During the trial, a former housekeeper delivered the line that would define Helmsley's public legacy, claiming she had heard her say, "We do not pay taxes, only the little people pay taxes." Whether bravado or cruelty, the phrase lodged in the national memory, a perfect headline for an era obsessed with winners and losers. The jury's decision in late summer of 1989 was sweeping. Helmsley was convicted of conspiracy to defraud the United States, multiple counts of tax evasion and filing false returns, aiding in false corporate and partnership filings, and mail fraud. The case distilled to a simple narrative. Personal costs routed through companies the Helmsleys owned or controlled. Headlines called it a morality play. The court record read like a ledger. She initially received a 4-year prison term, later reshaped on appeal and resentencing. Reporting to custody became an image of contrast. On tax day in the early 90s, she flew by company jet to Kentucky and arrived by limousine at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington. Later, she was moved to the minimum security women's camp in Danbury, a short drive from the manicured grounds of her Greenwich estate. There were brief humanitarian furloughs for her ailing husband's surgery, but the larger fact remained. The Hotel Empress was now inmate, adapting to count times and communal routines. The legal outcome was severe but not maximal. Although the original sentence was 4 years, she ultimately served roughly 19 months behind bars and additional time under house arrest, emerging a figure both diminished and indelible. Appeals trimmed but did not erase the verdict. Fines and public scrutiny further chipped at the aura of invincibility that had once filled her lobbies. Even in retrospectives years later, the story returned to the same core contrasts. A woman who could command a skyline facing the unadorned rules of federal tax law, and a culture enthralled by the spectacle of a fall from grace. In psychological terms, the portrait is complicated. Admirers cite relentless discipline and a builder's eye. Critics describe authoritarian control and contempt for those beneath her. The trial record offers a cleaner, colder motive. The rationalization of private luxury as business necessity, sustained until evidence and testimony closed the distance between suspicion and certainty. Today, the record stands unchanged. Convicted in the late 80s on federal tax charges, Leona Helmsley served approximately 19 months in prison and later completed a period of home confinement before returning, quieter but still famous, to a life beyond the headlines. Number 3. Sante Kimes moved through elite rooms with the confidence of someone who had learned to turn charm into leverage. Born Sante Louise Singers and later married to millionaire motel developer Kenneth Kimes Sr., she fashioned herself as a socialite and a strategist, a woman who knew the value of introductions and the power of a polished story. By the late 1990s, that story had begun to fray, revealing a parallel life of cons, forged identities, and meticulously planned schemes carried out alongside her devoted son. Her world gleamed with the trappings of privilege: elegant residences, first-class travel, tailored suits, and the practiced ease of moving among benefactors and celebrities. The couple's money underwrote a life of constant motion, hotels, house staff, and opportunities that opened at a smile. Yet beneath the sheen was a relentless pursuit of control over people and property. The sort of entitlement that treats boundaries as puzzles to be solved. That duality, couture on the surface, coercion underneath, would soon collide with the marble salons of an Upper East Side mansion. Pressure points defined her path to ruin. After the death of her husband, investigators and journalists later described a pattern of financial desperation wrapped in audacity. Bad checks, fraudulent loans, and aliases layered like costume changes. With her son as constant accomplice, she allegedly rationalized each new line crossed as a necessary bridge to the next windfall. Attorneys would argue that the state's narrative overstated the evidence. Reporters chronicled a mother who could script a role for herself in any city, and recruit her son to play the part. In the summer of 1998, a wealthy widow named Irene Silverman vanished from her Beaux-Arts townhouse on East 65th Street in Manhattan. The Kimes duo had already drawn Silverman's suspicion. The son rented under an alias, avoided identification, and bristled at the doorman's scrutiny. That same day, police arrested mother and son on unrelated fraud matters. The items found with them sketched an elaborate scheme, including a forged deed transferring Silverman's townhouse to a shell company linked to Sante. No body was ever recovered. But investigators traced a lattice of recordings, keys, and documents that pointed to a single, chilling objective: seize the home by erasing its owner. The New York trial became a national spectacle. Prosecutors built their case around the conspiracy to steal the mansion, joining it to a catalog of scams that stretched across states. Jurors convicted Sante and her son of murder and more than 100 additional counts, including robbery, conspiracy, forgery, and grand larceny. The judge imposed the maximum: life without the possibility of parole, plus an additional term measured in well over a century, for a pair who had treated borders and jurisdictions as inconveniences. The verdict was a wall that would not move. In psychological portraits that followed, admirers of her cunning called her a mastermind. Detractors called her a predator who exploited loyalty and glamour to conceal coercion. The record suggests a simpler engine. Financial motive fused to manipulation, perfected over decades, and made more dangerous by the unquestioning aid of a son who believed in her. California prosecutors would later try the pair for the killing of businessman David Kasdan, extending the narrative of schemes that ended in irreversible harm. Prison ended the performance. Sante Kimes served her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, far from the hotels and townhouses that once framed her life. In late spring of 2014, at 79 years old, she died behind bars in New York. The final chapter written without suspense or spectacle. Today, the legal record remains intact. Convicted in New York of the murder of Irene Silverman and an array of related felonies, Sante Kimes received life without parole plus century-scale additional time, and she died in custody at Bedford Hills. Number 4. Martha Stewart built a public life out of precision. The table settings, the seasonal wreaths, the calm authority of her voice, all of it rested on a harder truth. She was a ferocious entrepreneur who stitched magazines, television, retail, and licensing into a single, gleaming brand. In the late 1990s, her company went public, and by the closing bell, she was a billionaire on paper. Widely reported as the first female self-made billionaire in the United States, success looked effortless. It was anything but. Her world projected effortless privilege rather than casual flash. A Bedford estate with sweeping lawns, meticulous kitchens outfitted like studios, private flights for tight schedules and high-stakes meetings. She was the product and the executive, the on-air host and the chairwoman, moving through boardrooms and garden paths with the same clipped focus. That dual identity, domestic authority and modern tycoon, made her ascent feel inevitable. And it made what followed feel almost impossible to square with the brand she had perfected. Pressure began with a single trade. In late December of 2001, she sold nearly 4,000 shares of Clone Systems the day before. Bad news crashed the stock. Investigators suspected an unlawful tip from her broker's office and began pulling threads. Stewart and her broker argued there had been a standing instruction to sell if the price fell to a set figure. A story that would become the backbone of her defense and, later, the heart of the government's claim that she had lied. The case that reached a Manhattan courtroom in early spring of 2004 was not, in the end, about insider trading. Jurors heard about phone calls, not recipes, memos, not centerpieces. After weeks of testimony, they convicted Stewart on 4 counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal investigators. The verdict reframed an icon as a defendant who had tried to steer investigators away from the real reason for her sale. She was sentenced that summer to 5 months in federal prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of supervised release, along with a $30,000 fine. Prison life offered none of the control that had defined her company. She reported to the federal facility at Alderson in West Virginia in the fall, adapted to early counts and communal routines, and walked out in early March of 2005 to complete home confinement on her Bedford property. Cameras trailed the jet, the drive, the gate, the choreography of a return choreographed by someone used to setting the scene. Then she went back to work, folding the experience into her public story without letting it consume the brand she had built. Psychologically, the portrait is more complex than a headline. Admirers see a driven founder punished not for trading but for dishonesty about the trade. Critics see a powerful executive who thought precision with the truth could be part of the craft. Either way, the engine of the downfall was not a spreadsheet trick or a secret recipe. It was the decision to mislead, documented in testimony, and reconstructed in court. And yet the empire endured. Books, television, partnerships, an unbroken line of output that reclaimed the narrative through sheer volume of work and the familiar cadence of her voice. Today, the record is straightforward and final. Convicted in March of 2004 of conspiracy, obstruction, and making false statements, Martha Stewart served 5 months at the federal prison in Alderson, completed 5 months of home confinement, and continued on 2 years of supervised release before resuming the leadership of a media empire that had once made her a billionaire on paper. Number 5. Paris Hilton moved through velvet ropes as if they were air, a heiress whose last name was a passport and a brand. A great-granddaughter of the Hilton Hotel's founder, she became a fixture of early reality television and a staple of celebrity tabloids, photographed in couture on red carpets and stepping from private cars with an entourage of flashbulbs. The image was effortless, curated, and everywhere. It made what happened next feel like a break in the film, a hard cut from champagne rooms to concrete corridors. Her wealth and social standing were impossible to miss. Beverly Hills mansions, luxury suites that doubled as stages. A personal style that turned simple errands into runway exits. She understood the power of visibility and used it to launch clothing lines, fragrances, and appearances that blurred business with lifestyle. Yet the high gloss existed alongside ordinary rules of the road. And one night in late summer changed the tone of the coverage, from playful to prosecutorial. The turning point began with an alcohol-related reckless driving case in the late months of 2006. She later pleaded no contest to a reduced charge and was placed on probation with conditions she was required to follow. In the months that followed, officers twice stopped her while she was behind the wheel, and prosecutors argued that driving on a suspended license along with missed compliance steps violated the court's orders. What might have been a forgettable celebrity headline hardened into a legal problem with real consequences. In early May of 2007, a Los Angeles judge sentenced her to 45 days in the county jail for the probation violation, specifying no electronic monitoring in lieu of custody. She was ordered to report in early June. The announcement ricocheted across networks and websites, amplifying every procedural step into spectacle. When she surrendered at the women's jail in Linwood, the contrast was cinematic. A reality television star entering a world of schedules, counts, and institutional routine. Within a few days, the sheriff's department reassigned her to home confinement on medical grounds, fitting her with an electronic monitor and sending her to finish the sentence at home. Public officials and prosecutors objected, and the judge who had imposed the original sentence ordered her back to court and then back to jail, rejecting the early reassignment. The tug-of-war over custody became a national debate about celebrity justice and the limits of discretion inside a crowded jail system. By late June, the term was effectively resolved. She served 23 days in custody at Los Angeles County facilities before release. On the day she walked out, cameras tracked every step from the gate to the waiting car. And by nightfall, she was seated for a primetime interview, telling the country that the experience had changed her. Analysts later noted that, measured against comparable cases in the same system, her time served was not unusually short, and in many instances was longer. The headlines moved on. The lesson, at least in legal terms, was simple. Probation carries rules, and breaking them carries consequences, regardless of a last name. Psychologically, the portrait is less about rebellion than about inevitability. A public figure whose fame magnified each decision until the ordinary mechanics of probation became theater. Friends described a young woman chastened by confinement. Critics saw privilege bending policy, until a judge snapped it back. Both readings share a spine of fact that cannot be edited away. Today, the record is straightforward. In 2007, Paris Hilton served 23 days in a Los Angeles County jail for violating probation in an alcohol-related reckless driving case, and then resumed her public life. Number 6. Felicity Huffman moved through Hollywood with the poise of a veteran. An Academy Award-nominated actor whose work on prestige films and a hit suburban drama made her both respected and recognizable. Married to fellow actor William H. Macy and long established in elite creative circles, she projected competence and composure, a professional who knew how to balance red carpets, rehearsal rooms, and family life. That equilibrium wavered when federal agents unspooled a college admissions scheme that would make her the first parent sentenced in a case that dominated headlines. Her wealth and social standing were visible but rarely ostentatious. A comfortable Los Angeles life, industry parties that doubled as business meetings, and a portfolio of roles that paid for privacy more than spectacle. She was not a tabloid billionaire. She was a working star with influence, access, and options. That context is essential, because the scandal that followed did not begin in a lavish penthouse or a private jet. It began, as so many modern anxieties do, with fear about a child's future and the pressure to keep pace in a competitive world. The turning point was a payment of $15,000 to a consultant whose method involved quietly fixing standardized test answers. Prosecutors called it a conspiracy to commit mail fraud and honest services mail fraud. Huffman, after initial shock and reflection, entered a guilty plea and issued a public apology that acknowledged the harm and the misplaced logic behind her choice. She described the decision as an attempt to secure opportunity, not an excuse. It did not diminish the crime. In a Boston courtroom in mid-September of 2019, the government asked for a month in custody. The defense sought probation. The judge landed precisely in the middle of public expectation and legal precedent, imposing 14 days in federal prison, a $30,000 fine, a year of supervised release, and 250 hours of community service. The sentence mattered not only for her, but for the signal it sent to dozens of other parents waiting their turn at the lectern. She was, unmistakably, the first to face the consequences. She reported to the Women's Federal Facility in Dublin, California, a low-security prison east of the Bay, and began the routines that reduce a public figure to an inmate number: early counts, shared spaces, and regulated calls. The location was not incidental. It placed her within reach of family in Los Angeles, while reflecting the court's emphasis on a short, certain term. She served most of the 2-week sentence, with release calculated under Bureau of Prisons scheduling rules that free inmates early when official dates fall on weekends. The total time in custody came to roughly 11 days. Outside the walls, the debate churned. Some called the punishment too light. Others pointed to similar cases and noted that the time served was consistent with routine practice for short federal sentences. Inside, the experience was reportedly sobering. Afterward, Huffman completed the remaining conditions: the fine, the supervised release, and the 250 hours of community service. Years later, she would describe the scandal as a rupture that forced a long period of reckoning and work, while continuing to support programs that help women re-enter society after incarceration. Motivation, in her own framing, was a mix of fear and certainty, the misguided belief that one intervention could secure a pathway. Prosecutors offered a simpler narrative: fraud dressed as concern. The record, stripped of debate, is clear and complete. Today, Felicity Huffman stands as the first parent sentenced in the nationwide college admissions case. Having pleaded guilty, served approximately 11 days in federal custody at Dublin, paid a $30,000 fine, and finished 250 hours of community service and a year of supervised release. Number 7. Loughlin walked red carpets with an easy smile. A television star whose face was familiar in living rooms across the country. Long before the scandal that would define her public reckoning, she had built a reputation for wholesome roles and steady professionalism. a working celebrity with influence, access, and a carefully managed family life shared with fashion designer Massimo Giannulli. That image, polished, prosperous, and safe, collided with a federal investigation that turned college admissions anxiety into a criminal case with national stakes. Her world projected privilege without ostentation. A comfortable Los Angeles existence. Industry dinners that doubled as business meetings. Daughters growing up in the orbit of entertainment and design. The family had choices. They had connections. And, as prosecutors would allege, they had a direct line to a fixer whose secret method promised to open doors at an elite university. The contrast between private opportunity and public rules became the fault line on which her story would crack. The turning point was a payment described by the government as $500,000, routed to a scheme that presented the couple's daughters as rowing recruits to the University of Southern California, even though they did not participate in the sport. When agents moved, the headlines were immediate and unforgiving. Loughlin and Giannulli at first fought the charges, then reversed course. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, acknowledging her role in a plan that gamed a system already criticized for favoring the well-connected. In late August of 2020, a federal judge in Boston imposed sentence: 2 months in prison, a $150,000 fine, 2 years of supervised release, and 100 hours of community service. The court emphasized accountability and parity with similar cases, noting her husband's longer term given his greater involvement. The message was clear. Fame could not insulate a parent from the legal consequences of cheating an admissions process that millions navigate without special help. She reported to the federal prison in Dublin, California at the end of October, beginning a brief term that nonetheless carried the full disorienting choreography of custody. Processing, counts, schedules, the flattening anonymity of an inmate number. There were no makeup chairs, no studio lights, only institutional routine, and a calendar that ticked toward release near the end of December. The location mattered for the record and for family logistics. It also symbolized how swiftly a household name can become a case file. Public reaction was split. Some argued that 2 months was too little. Others noted that short first-time federal sentences routinely result in comparable custodial periods, and that her term matched the negotiated plea. After custody, she completed the remaining conditions: supervised release, community service, and the financial penalty. In interviews and coverage that followed, the narrative shifted to aftermath and repair, not exoneration, but the quieter work of returning to ordinary life under a lasting cloud. Psychologically, the case reads as pressure meeting access. Parents everywhere fear missed chances. Few have the pathway to manufacture a resume line and pay for it. Prosecutors offered a stark motive fraud dressed as concern, and the court accepted it. The fall here is not from royalty so much as from credibility. A reminder that the rules exist to hold a line even when the people crossing it are famous. Today, the record is straightforward. Lori Loughlin pleaded guilty in the national admissions case, served a 2-month term at the federal prison in Dublin, paid a $150,000 fine, and completed court-ordered community service and 2 years of supervised release. Number 8. Clare Bronfman grew up with a last name that unlocked private rooms and silent nods. The youngest daughter of Edgar Bronfman Sr. and an heiress to the Seagram fortune. In public, she appeared disciplined and self-possessed, a competitive equestrian who favored discretion over spectacle. That reserve shifted when she committed herself to an Albany-based self-help organization led by Keith Raniere, first as a devotee and then as a financier, moving from student to executive power broker inside a group later described in court as a criminal enterprise. Her world radiated privilege, quiet estates, international travel, introductions to power, and the confidence that comes from generational wealth. The allure of NXIVM offered something different, a promise of personal mastery and measurable progress. With access to extraordinary resources, she underwrote projects, legal offensives, and expansion efforts that amplified the organization's influence. Years before the prosecutions, reporting had already linked the Bronfman family fortunes to NXIVM's ambitions, describing spending that reached into 9-figure territory and a posture toward critics that relied on money as pressure. The contrast was striking. Philanthropic pedigree bending toward an increasingly secretive cause. The turning points were incremental but decisive. Prosecutors later argued that loyalty had hardened into protection of a leader, a brand, and a worldview even as allegations mounted. In the government's account, she used wealth and status to defend the organization, bankroll litigation, and keep key people close. The psychological engine reads as devotion meeting capacity. A believer with the means to act, convinced that scrutiny was persecution rather than warning. The crimes of conviction did not center on the most lurid allegations that surrounded NXIVM. They were quieter and technical, but they mattered. In the spring of 2019, Bronfman pleaded guilty to conspiracy, to conceal and harbor aliens for financial gain, and to fraudulent use of identification. The record details an immigrant brought in under false pretenses and the misuse of another person's identity to support the group's activities. Those admitted facts placed her inside the machinery that sustained NXIVM's operations. In late September of 2020, a federal judge in Brooklyn imposed a sentence of 81 months in prison, a substantial term that far exceeded what many expected for those specific counts. The court also ordered a significant forfeiture, a fine, and restitution to a named victim, emphasizing that her offenses existed within the larger pattern of NXIVM's misconduct. Appeals failed to disturb the result. The sentence stood. The numbers told their own story. Years, not months. A message that money and loyalty would not insulate a high-ranking insider. Behind bars, the setting changed, but the scrutiny did not. Bronfman served time in federal custody, including at the women's facility in Danbury and at the Federal Detention Center in Philadelphia, before transitioning to community confinement in New York City. Court filings and local reporting noted that she moved to a Bronx halfway house in early May of 2024, with Bureau of Prisons records projecting custody through late June of 2025. By the end of that month, multiple reports indicated she had been released from BOP custody and begun a period of supervised release. The trajectory from estates to halfway house was complete. Today, the public record reflects that Clare Bronfman pleaded guilty to immigration and identity-related felonies in connection with NXIVM, received a sentence of 6 years and 9 months, and, after serving the custodial portion, moved to supervised release following her late June 2025 release from federal custody. Number 9. Ghislaine Maxwell moved easily through salons where favors were traded in whispers and introductions were currency. A British-born socialite whose father was media tycoon Robert Maxwell, and whose circle included financiers, editors, and royals. For years she appeared beside Jeffrey Epstein at galas and in glossy photographs, a poised fixer with a cosmopolitan resume and a passport stamped from coast to coast. The public image was polish and access. The private reality, federal prosecutors later argued, was proximity to a predatory scheme that turned status into cover. Her wealth and standing framed every scene. Townhouses and town cars, private jets, and secluded estates. Invitations that opened doors most people never see, matched by the quiet confidence of someone raised to feel at home in any elite room. That sheen mattered, because it initially insulated her from suspicion. It also made the fall more stark. When the cameras finally followed her not into ballrooms but into courtrooms, the contrast became the story. Couture swapped for a defense table. Influence measured now in legal counsel and filings. The turning points arrived as accusations sharpened into sworn statements and then into federal charges. Investigators said loyalty had crossed into facilitation, that she recruited and groomed vulnerable girls for Epstein under the guise of opportunity and mentorship. Maxwell denied it, but at trial, witnesses and records pulled a pattern into focus. By late December of 2021, a Manhattan jury returned its decision. Guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including conspiracy and sex trafficking of a minor. The verdict punctured the mythology of glamour that had long surrounded her name. The legal outcome was severe. In late June of 2022, the judge imposed a sentence of 20 years in federal prison, emphasizing that the conduct spanned years and exploited unequal power. The USC Attorney for the Southern District of New York called the punishment a message that no one stands above the law. And victims addressed the court about harm that could not be undone. Maxwell spoke, too, casting Epstein as manipulative while stopping short of full acceptance of the jury's view. The sentence stood as a public accounting of privilege used to harm. Appeals followed and failed. In mid-September of 2024, the Second Circuit affirmed her convictions and sentence, rejecting arguments that an older non-prosecution agreement shielded her, and that jury issues demanded a new trial. In early October of 2025, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively ending her direct appeals. The law had spoken at every level. What remained was time. Life inside federal custody has been closely tracked. After sentencing, she was designated to a low-security facility in Tallahassee, Florida, the sort of place designed for routine and control rather than spectacle. More recently, the Bureau of Prisons transferred her to a minimum-security federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas. A move reported by major outlets, though not publicly explained in detail by officials, either setting strips away the trappings that once defined her life. Both mark the fixed boundaries of a sentence measured in years, not headlines. Motivation, in the court's portrait, was a compound of access, loyalty, and the cold efficiency of grooming. Defense attorneys argued that prosecutors overreached and that Maxwell herself was a target of public anger meant for Epstein. Appellate judges disagreed, upholding a record that framed her as coordinator and facilitator. The psychological reading will be debated for years by commentators. The legal record is not ambiguous. Today, Ghislaine Maxwell stands convicted on 5 counts related to the sex trafficking of minors, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, and is serving that term in federal custody following her transfer to the prison camp in Bryan, Texas. Number 10. Elizabeth Holmes cultivated a voice that sounded like certainty. A Stanford dropout who promised to reinvent blood testing and, in doing so, medicine itself. In her 20s, she founded Theranos, gathered an elite board, and presented herself as the rare founder who could turn a single drop of blood into a full diagnostic map. By the middle of the last decade, the company's paper value reached a height reported in the billions, and she was profiled as the youngest self-made female billionaire on record. The public story was ambition married to inevitability. The private reality would not survive scrutiny. Her world looked like victory. Black turtlenecks and keynote stages, a Silicon Valley campus with gleaming labs, a roster of high-status investors, and meetings where the promise of disruption did most of the talking. She moved through conferences as if already an institution, drawing power from proximity to senators, generals, and tycoons who treated her claims as fait accompli. The aesthetic was minimalist, almost monastic, a branding choice that suggested rigor while deflecting questions about process. Wealth and reputation became part of the product itself. The turning points began as questions. Scientists, partners, and reporters asked for data that matched the pitch. What started as doubt hardened into investigations and then into indictments, as federal prosecutors alleged that the technology did not do what she said it did, and that investors were misled about accuracy, partnerships, and revenue. The narrative of inevitability cracked, replaced by a courtroom calendar and a record measured not in press clippings but in exhibits. In early January of 2022, a San Jose jury delivered a split verdict that nonetheless defined her future. Guilty on 4 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, all tied to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on several patient-related charges, and the jury hung on others. The distinction mattered. The government's case that prevailed focused on investors and the gap between what they were told and what the machines could do. Sentencing came in late November of 2022. The judge imposed a term of 11 years and 3 months, later accompanied by a restitution order that held her and her former chief operating officer jointly liable to investors in an amount measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Appeals followed. First to challenge custody while she sought review, and then to attack the convictions themselves. The efforts failed. In late February of 2025, the Ninth Circuit affirmed her convictions, sentence, and the restitution order. In May of the same year, the court declined to rehear the case. She reported to a minimum security federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, at the end of May of 2023, beginning the ordinary routines that replace the pace of a startup with the stillness of custody. Bureau of Prisons records and coverage have since reflected projected release dates in the early years of the next decade. Reflecting standard federal calculations for good time credit and programming, the facility itself is designed for low security and predictable schedules, the kind of place where notoriety fades into uniformity. Psychologically, the portrait that emerges from the record is ambition turned axiomatic, a founder who treated belief as evidence and presentation as proof. Prosecutors described deliberate deception. Her defense suggested good faith overreach and misplaced trust in subordinates. Appellate judges returned to the same center line. Investors were told things that were not true, and money followed those assurances. The broader debate about hype and hope in technology will continue. The legal outcome will not. Today, Elizabeth Holmes stands convicted on 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, and she is serving that term at the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas.